There are so many forgotten stories of people who should be lionized in American history from Black history, stories that have been buried over and not focused on. Well, I want to share one with you today. There is a guy named Robert Smalls. He was one of the first Congresspeople who was Black to ever serve in our nation, but his story is unbelievable in its courage, its heroism. Robert Smalls was a slave. He was an enslaved person serving on a ship called the Planter in the South. When Fort Sumter was taken as one of the first acts of the Confederacy, he was there in South Carolina, and on that ship, he made a plot to steal this valuable vessel and turn it over to the Union forces. And so he had this plot and took over that vessel, sailing it to Fort Sumter, which was controlled by the Confederacy. He adorned himself obviously with the captain of the ship. In the dark of night, they just thought the Planter was the name of the ship. The Planter was just sailing on by, but then all of a sudden it turned and raced towards the Union lines. And he suspected that it would catch them so by surprise that they wouldn't fire on him. Well, they didn't fire on him, but then he had to turn himself over to the Union lines who were looking at this enemy ship approaching. And he was able to signal them that he was surrendering the vessel. Robert Smalls was a war hero, lionized at that point all around our country in newspapers for this incredible act of bravery in getting this valuable ship into the Union hands. And then he served on that vessel. And in a naval battle off the coast of South Carolina, the captain of the ship, Union captain, was going to surrender. He was surrounded. And Robert Smalls mutinied. He basically told this white captain that if you surrender to the Confederacy, you will be treated as an officer. We, the Black people on this vessel, will be killed. And so he mutinied, took control of the ship, and was able to win the battle, or at least navigate the Planter out of harm's way and get it back to the safety of the Union lines. He was an inspiring human being because after the war, he went on as a war hero, going on a trolley car in Philadelphia, told to sit in the back. He refused. This is generations before we saw the fight in Montgomery to integrate the buses there. He actually led and got the integration of trolley cars in Philadelphia. He became an elected leader in the state legislature of South Carolina and introduced one of our nation's earliest bills for public education in South Carolina. And then eventually, through lots of acts of heroism and enlightenment, he eventually became one of our first Congresspeople. Now, this is a great chapter in Black history. His life is so extraordinary. He is just one of the thousands and thousands of heroic people whose names we don't know, whose stories we should know, whose stories should inspire us today to show the same levels of courage, because our country still calls, it still commands us to be involved in the fight for justice in our nation. There are still too many wrongs that must be righted. There is still that arc of the moral universe that must be bent by us arc benders towards justice. Let our Black history not just lie in dusty books and forgotten tomes. Let us make it live again through the stories we share, through the inspiration we reap, and through the work that we do today to honor that history so generations to come can celebrate what we have done together for the cause of our country. Thank you.
Welcome to the Hamilton Cast Read-Alongs, sponsored by the Gilder Lehrman Institute. Hi everyone, I'm your narrator, Keisha Rembert, and I'm a teacher, a learner, a lover of history and all things books, and I'm joining you from the Windy City. Do you know where that is? Right, Chicago. And I'm happy that you are joining us wherever you are. Our read-alongs feature Hamilton cast members reading picture books and discussing the history behind them. Our goal each week is to give you, students, an educational and literary experience with members of the theater community. It's an interactive way to hear your favorite stories or to be introduced to new stories that you may not know. I encourage you to go to gilderlehrman.org to learn all about what Gilder Lehrman has to offer. If you're a Hamilton fan, and I'm sure that you are, you can register for EduHam online by going to hamilton.gilderlehrman.org. Now, let's learn about today's storyteller. It might take me a long time to read, or just as long to read about this person as it does for our storyteller to read the book, because he has a long list of accomplishments. Chris Jackson is our storyteller today, and he is a Tony Award-winning actor, a Tony Award nominated actor, and an award-winning songwriter, composer, Grammy Award winner. And he stars in CBS's Bull. He's been in that little show that you might have heard about before called Hamilton on Broadway. And in addition to that, he's done numerous other Broadway works, including film and television and more. He even had a chance to sing one last time a song from Hamilton at the White House. How cool is that? So, without further ado, welcome, Chris.
Hi, everybody. Really excited to be here with you guys today.
That had to be so cool and amazing to perform at the White House for a sitting president.
I still am trying to understand how that all happened.
I know.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Just watching it, I was just in awe. So thank you so much for joining us today. So many people in the chat are saying that you are their favorite.
Oh, thanks, guys.
I am going to talk to you a little bit about today's book, everyone, because it really takes us on a heroic adventure. So think about this. How would you define hero? Today's story is about a real life hero. He was smart, he was brave, and he was daring. And his name, as you might have guessed, was Robert Smalls. And he lived a long time ago in a time in the United States during slavery. Slavery is when people bought and owned other people as property. Robert was enslaved. He wished for his freedom and the ability to make decisions for himself. And he lived in a time also of war in the United States. So this story takes place in 1862, and in 1861 in the United States, 7 states in the South, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas seceded. And let me tell you what seceded means. It means they left. They left to form their own country called the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States then went to war with 23 states in the North and in the West. The Northern states, including those West Coast states, California and Oregon, called themselves the Union. And the 7 states called themselves the Confederacy. And they went to war over slavery. The Union didn't want slavery to keep expanding and moving in other places. And the Confederacy wanted to keep slavery because enslaved people from Africa were farming their land for free. So this issue of slavery divided the nation, and many battles were fought before the North won the war in 1865. Robert Smalls' story happened during the Civil War, and he made this truly remarkable journey on the waterways. And water transportation and the waterways were really important during the Civil War because they helped transport goods and supplies to soldiers and made it really easy. Robert used this to his advantage. And so I'll turn it over to Chris to read for you about this adventure.
Okay, guys, are you ready? This is such an amazing story. On the evening of May 12, 1862, Charleston Harbor echoed with the sounds of dusk at the docks. Men murmured to one another as they retired from a long day's work. Crickets chirped. Water lapped against ships. But underneath the peaceful concert was the thump, thump, thump of Robert Smalls' racing heart. Robert Smalls was born into slavery. enslaved people were considered the legal property of another person. Almost 4 million Black people were enslaved at the time of the Civil War. They had no rights. They lived and worked in brutal conditions, and they received no pay. The atmosphere was tense on that dark, foggy evening. The Confederate Army was fighting against the Union Army. Southern Confederates wanted to secede from the United States. Slavery was legal in the South, and those states wanted to keep it. Union troops from the North fought to keep the U.S. together. The Union wanted to outlaw slavery. The Union Navy was blockading Charleston, South Carolina. Confederate ships, forts, and soldiers were on guard. They were ready to protect the city from enemy attacks. Charles Relia was the captain of the Confederate steamship Planter. He decided to take a break for the night to visit with family. As on many other nights, Relia left Robert Smalls in charge. Captains were supposed to stay on their ships. They were expected to be ready to sail at a moment's notice. If Relia were caught, he could face a court-martial. He might lose command of his ship. Smalls saluted Relia and the other white officers as they left the Planter. Smalls knew Charleston Harbor as well as anyone. When he was 12 years old, Smalls was sent by his owner to look for a job in Charleston. He worked at the waterfront, performing many different jobs on boats. While he worked, Smalls carefully watched the crews and learned their responsibilities. He earned $16 a month, but most of it went to his owner. Smalls negotiated with his owner to keep a small amount for himself. In 1861, Smalls was hired as a crew member on the Planter. He quickly mastered skills such as line handling, knot tying, and getting underway. He learned how to secure ships at the docks with ropes and chains. These skills would help Smalls as he moved up the ranks. Smalls worked hard to memorize ship routes. He learned where hazards existed in the harbor, such as sandbars under the surface of the water. Because Smalls was enslaved, he was not recognized, as the ship's pilot, but he performed these duties regularly. His highest position was wheelman. As the wheelman, Smalls steered the ship. Now, on a typical night, Smalls would clean and organize the ship for the next day. But tonight was not a typical night. Smalls was preparing to carry out a dangerous plan. Smalls' crewmates said that he had gotten the idea to steal the Confederate steamship months before. Smalls had stood near the wheel of the steamship one day. One of his crewmates put a big straw hat on Smalls' head. Someone joked that he looked like Captain Relia. Both men had short, stocky builds. They folded their arms in a similar manner. Smalls began to carefully observe Relia at the helm. He took note of the captain's movements. He memorized the signals required to pass checkpoints. He studied how Relia moved his hands on the wheel. He copied the way he tilted his hat. He practiced until he was able to mimic the captain perfectly. On May 12, 1862, Captain Relia had left that very hat on one of his uniforms on the ship. Around 3 a.m. on the 13th, Smalls donned the captain's uniform. He pulled the wide-brimmed straw hat low on his forehead. He hunched over the wheel like the captain did. He was ready to put his training to use. The spring night was inky black. Fog filled the air. Seeing where the sky ended and the murky waters began was almost impossible. The conditions were perfect for Smalls' escape. Smalls and the rest of the crew were taking a big risk. They would steal a Confederate ship and sail it toward the Union blockade. If all went as planned, they could eventually enter Union territory. No person had done this before. They would pass armed forts where soldiers were on alert. They would risk their lives for the chance to be free. Smalls enlisted the help of the other enslaved crewmen. He planned to bring their families to freedom, but there was a great risk involved. Steamboats make lots of noise and smoke as they move through the water. Sneaking unnoticed past the forts would be impossible. Because they couldn't sneak, they'd have to boldly sail right under the Confederates' noses. The planter would follow a 10-mile route. The beginning of the voyage would take place within the view of General Ripley's headquarters. General Ripley was the commander for Charleston. He was in charge of military vessels in the harbor. They would need to pass several Confederate forts. Soldiers with guns would be standing guard. They would be ready to shoot. Only when the planter passed those forts would they have the chance to enter Union-controlled waters. Smalls knew they would also need to act quickly once the planter approached the Union fleet. Union forces might mistake them for enemy soldiers and fire on them. There was danger on all sides. If caught by the Confederacy, Smalls and the other runaways would be punished harshly. The Confederates relied on the planter. It was used to transport personnel and supplies to the forts around the harbor. In fact, the planter had just been loaded with artillery the previous day. 200 pounds of ammunition were on board the ship, plus guns and cannons. The weapons were supposed to be delivered to forts later that day. The Confederate military would rather sink the planter than see all those weapons land in enemy hands. Smalls would rather use the weaponry to fight to the death than allow himself to be captured. The families of the crewmen waited in secret at the North Atlantic Wharf. Smalls' wife and children were among them. They hid inside another boat at the wharf until the planter arrived. Years before, Smalls had tried to buy his family's freedom. At the time, he didn't have the money, but now he was enacting a new plan to gain their freedom. If they succeeded, the reward would be priceless. As the crew prepared to set sail, two of the crewmen became very frightened. Runaway slaves were often whipped. They could be sold into harsher conditions or even killed. The two men decided to leave the ship. The remaining 7 crewmen worried, would their departing crewmates give away the escape plans? But Smalls carried on. He ordered the crew to prepare for departure. They piled wood into a stove to boil water and produce steam. The steam created energy to move the boat. On deck, the crew hoisted the Confederate flag and the South Carolina flag to maintain their disguise. The planter set off toward the North Atlantic Wharf, moving in a different location from its typical route. Luckily, no one seemed to notice. The steamship paused at the wharf. The crew members' families sneaked off the boat they were hiding in and climbed aboard the planter. A total of 16 runaway slaves were now on board. The steamer cranked, hissed, and whistled as it got underway. Every time it made a noise, the passengers held their breath. They prayed no one noticed anything suspicious. Smalls steered the boat toward Fort Johnson. It was the first of 2 heavily armed forts they would pass. The crew steeled themselves for whatever was to come. Fort Johnson was about 2 miles away on James Island. To the planter crew, that distance felt like 2,000 miles. The fort had cannonball-firing mortars and soldiers on guard, and the soldiers were armed with guns. As the planter sailed close to Fort Johnson, the crewmen braced themselves for gunfire. They crouched and covered their heads, waiting for cannonballs to pound the ship. But the guards at Fort Johnson were tired. They noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The planter sailed past the fort safely. The crew quietly celebrated. Fort Johnson was their first big test. But as the planter sailed on, Small's crew noticed that a Confederate guard boat ahead. The guard boat monitored activity in the area. The crew of the guard boat had no idea the planter had carried runaway slaves. Smalls remained calm. He stood in the small cabin atop the planter and saluted the other captain. Then he tugged at the rope to sound the whistle as they passed. Smalls even shouted a greeting to the pilot. The planter crew had succeeded again. The biggest challenge lay before them. Soldiers at Fort Sumter looked out for suspicious activity. They were instructed to destroy enemy vessels. Fort Sumter was where the first shots of the Civil War had been fired 13 months before. The fort was surrounded by walls that reached 50 feet above the water. Loaded cannons were all around. The planter was due to pass Fort Sumter at about 4 in the morning. The hour was early enough that Smalls and his crew would still be disguised by the dusk. It was also late enough in the morning that he wouldn't be suspicious. The soldiers would assume the planter was setting out on its typical business route for the day. Up ahead, logs floated in the water, blocking the planter's path. Smalls had to steer the ship very close to the walls of Fort Sumter to avoid them. The people on board the planter held their breath, terrified. One person said he felt as if he was a rabbit in front of a dog. Some of the crew fell to the deck. They covered their heads, expecting cannon fire. Others stood still and grabbed hold of their pants to keep their hands from shaking. But not Robert Smalls. As the leader, Smalls knew he must remain calm as they approached Fort Sumter. He pulled the whistle cord. He mimicked the code he had seen Captain Relia use many times before. 2 long toots and 1 short one. The sentry on duty didn't see anything amiss with the planter. He yelled words of encouragement to Smalls, thinking he was part of the Confederacy, and let them pass. But minutes later, soldiers noticed something unusual. The planter was going the wrong way. It was supposed to take supplies to Morris Island. Instead, the ship was sailing toward the Union fleet. Now the soldiers knew something was wrong. They tried to fire on Smalls and his crew, but the steamer was too far away. They signaled to Morris Island to fire, but those cannons were also out of firing range. The Confederate soldiers could do nothing but watch as the planter sailed toward the Union ships. The runaways finally let their shoulders drop. Some wept with relief. Others danced, prayed, or sang, but they quickly ended their celebration. Their dangerous journey was not over. Smalls knew they could easily be mistaken for Confederate troops. He ordered the Confederate and South Carolina flags lowered as they approached the Union ships. In their place, Smalls instructed his crew to raise a white bedsheet. This would signal their peaceful surrender. The Onward, a Union warship, sat ahead. The planter was headed directly for it. Aboard the Union ship, Captain John Frederick Nichols called out to his crew, "All hands to quarters." He planned to destroy the enemy ship before it destroyed his own. The fog had helped Smalls earlier, but it was not helping now. The morning haze made it difficult for Union soldiers to see the white flag. They couldn't tell that the men on board the planter were not enemy soldiers. The Onward crew could only see that there was a warship headed toward them. It was coming from enemy territory. Roughly 100 Union soldiers on the Onward were now awake, and they raced to their battle stations. The Union soldiers aimed their cannons toward the planter. They waited for Nichols to give the order. On the planter, Smalls and his crew screamed and cried out. They had made it past the Confederate forts, but were about to be killed by the Union Navy. The men, the women, and children huddled together on the deck, and they prayed. Just as Nichols was about to command his crew to attack, he caught a glimpse of the white flag through the fog. He ordered his men to stand down. The wheelman steered the planter alongside the Onward. Smalls shouted, "Good morning, sir. I brought you some of the old United States guns, sir." For a few moments, the planter crew was frozen, and then it hit them. They were out of danger. Joy broke out among the crew and the passengers. "Hallelujah!" one of the women shouted. A group of men jumped and danced. A child who'd fallen asleep during the adventure woke to happy shouts and songs of merriment. Smalls looked over at the exuberant crew and smiled. His heart beat loudly and proudly. He had done it. Freedom at last.
Wow. Thank you so much for that awesome reading and the great ending to that story.
It's great, right?
It, it was amazing. And it was amazing because Robert Smalls had a plan and he learned as much as he could about that plan before he carried it out, and he did it. And he didn't even just do it for himself. That's what I love about the story too. I think there's a
Sure.
selfless element of it, that he did it for other people, that it wasn't just for he and his family, that it was for others people too.
Absolutely.
Thinking about that, have you ever done something brave like Robert did?
Oh man, I haven't had many occasions to stand on a boat that I've stolen from an enemy, and then in the middle of the night in the fog, grab up many others and navigate that. I've never been in those situations. The thing that strikes me so much about this story is that he did have a plan and he was thinking of others. And in the midst of executing that plan, he stayed calm.
Mm.
Much in the same way when you have studied for a test and you're sitting over this piece of paper and you feel this anxious feeling come all of you. What if I don't do this? What if I forget this? What if I didn't study this? But you stay calm, and then the answers, they come back to you. Or like when I'm about to go on stage to do a show and, oh my gosh, who's in the audience? Or am I going to remember all of my lines? And then you remember, stay calm. And your brain operates better that way, right? And it allows you to understand the situation that you're in,
Yeah.
and navigate it, much in the same way that Robert had to navigate that harbor. It's a great lesson that you can use in just about any part of your life. Though I haven't been swashbuckling and been able to rescue people on a
That was
boat.
next level brave. Like that's
Yes,
completely next
absolutely.
level brave. But
Absolutely.
I do agree that there are just small instances in your life that you can just take and use that. And I liked his observation too. He was so observant, and just this man who was willing to learn every aspect of the boat for freedom. And the book even says that they were willing to risk their lives for freedom, and their freedom
Sure.
was priceless. And when I think of freedom, I think it means to me being able to do what I can do for myself and my family, whenever or however I choose. What does freedom mean to you?
Exactly that. The freedom to be creative, the freedom to ask questions, the freedom to find answers, the freedom and access to information. We're talking about people who didn't readily have access to something as simple as a book, who weren't taught how, they weren't allowed to be taught. And so when you read about the accomplishments of folks who grew up under such incredibly difficult circumstances, well, for me, it just kind of reminds me of that there's nothing that we can't learn. There's nothing that we can't do. It's already been done in way worse circumstances than what most of us experience. And that's encouraging.
Yeah, that's a level of perseverance and self-determination that I
Yes.
think we can all learn from. And really, I'm really struck because that's just the beginning of his story. That's not even the end of his story. So
Yeah.
his story it doesn't even end with that work of freedom. He continues to work for freedom. And the author does a really great job in her afterword of pointing that out. Do you mind reading that portion of the afterwards? It starts with almost 200,000.
Sure. Almost 200,000 African Americans fought in the Civil War. Robert Smalls was among them. After escaping to the North, Smalls joined the Union Navy. He eventually became the first Black captain of a U.S. military ship. Smalls fought in 17 battles against the Confederacy and recruited African Americans to become soldiers for the Union. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This document declared enslaved people in rebel states to be free. The Civil War was brutal, and both sides lost many lives. At least 752,000 people died. 10,000 battles were fought. On April 9th, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered, and other Confederate generals soon followed. However, The ending of the war did not end slavery. It wasn't until December 1865, when the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, that slavery was outlawed on a national scale. Robert Smalls returned to South Carolina and bought his former slaveholders home. The U.S. Navy gave Smalls $1,500 for capturing the Confederate ship and delivering it to the Union. Smalls became a politician and served in the U.S. House of Representatives. He died in 1915, a retired U.S. congressman and U.S. Navy captain. But gaining freedom for himself and his family against all odds was perhaps his greatest accomplishment.
Wow. So that's just the prelude to the greatness that he had. I know you studied for your role in Hamilton, you studied George Washington. Do you see any connection or any similarities between George Washington and Robert Smalls?
Well, I mean, we'll look at the obvious thing. George Washington was a man who did great things, but George Washington had some very, very significant moral failures. The idea that any person can believe that they are entitled to own another person, it's almost where that sort of begins and ends. He did a lot of tremendous things, and he had a lot of wonderful accomplishments. But in my mind, I take this act of bravery that was exhibited by Robert Smalls, and I know that Washington was brave in the face of many battles, and he commanded a great many men. But the scale and the inspiration that I find from what Robert Smalls did just resonates with me in a completely different way, in a way that I feel to my bones, that my DNA will celebrate.
I think about just how far he had to come.
Yes.
How far he come, being born to an enslaved mother and being an enslaved person himself and having to endure all of that, and perhaps not being taught, but being a self-learned man to be
Yes.
able to command a ship and take other people to freedom, and then continue on that journey of freedom.
Yes.
To be a politician in the U.S. House of Representatives, when at that point, at that time, Black people weren't considered people who could hold that high a level in government. And really after that, we saw a lot of Black people didn't have access after Robert Smalls to the United States House of Representatives. So he was a pioneer in so many ways.
What's obvious to me too is that not only his bravery, but his heart for service. Yeah. Right? The idea that what you're doing it can benefit a greater good. Yeah. It's that spirit that I think the American dream aspires to, that we look out for our neighbor, that we care for our family, and that we care for ourselves, but they're all intertwined. And that the idea of community is the thing that makes this nation great. Because we have the freedom to have community, right? And we have the freedom to pursue looking out for other people. It's just a tremendous story.
Well, I appreciate you for your voice in that, and just even your expertise. I know that you did a lot of research and history work yourself in preparing for your role. So
sure.
I really appreciate that.